Welcome to the Better with Age podcast. My name is Galen Wetzell. I am your host today. I have the great privilege of being able to talk with Dr. Nate Champion of Champion Naturopathic Health today. Dr. Champion received his doctorate in naturopathic medicine from Southwest College of Naturopathic Medicine, now called Sonoran University of Health Sciences in Tempe, Arizona. He also holds a bachelor's degree in exercise science as well. Dr. Nate's an expert in treating digestive disorders, particularly inflammatory bowel disease, things like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and irritable bowel syndrome. I hope you enjoy our conversation today. We're going to talk all about gut health and some things that you can do today to help your gut function better. If you enjoy our conversation, please like and subscribe to this podcast as it helps us to reach new people with this great information. Hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Better with Age podcast. I'm your host, Galen Wetzell, today, and I have the great pleasure to talk with Dr. Nate Champion today of Champion Naturopathic Health. So thanks so much, Dr. Nate, for being here on a Friday. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Now, I have to ask, did you ever play youth sports? And by any chance, did you get to have your last name on your jersey?
No, I mean, I played basketball in junior high and high school, but outside of that, not a lot of jersey wearing with the name, but it has come in handy.
It's such a perfect name to be playing sports with. You're very clear about who you are and what you do. That's awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here again. Maybe give us a little background about how you got into naturopathic medicine. What drew you to that style of medicine over, let's say, osteopathy or allopathic medicine or something else?
Sure. Yeah, there was a few kind of key moments and reasons for that. One is at almost 19 years of age, I got diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, a type of inflammatory bowel disease, and did the conventional route initially for the first year or two, but just kept getting worse. Right? Just kept getting worse with my symptoms. Any of the medications, they just didn't work for me, or they worked for a very short period of time. And then, fast forward a couple of years, I ended up in the hospital halfway through undergrad in college, and they, were just like, we don't know what else to do other than take out your colon. And so I, that didn't seem very attractive to me at, 20-ish years of age. And so kind of really started seeking out alternatives. And at this time, I was halfway through undergrad and, considering conventional medical school, and was kind of studying for the entrance exam off and on. But then, it fell so short for me as far as that chronic illness goes. And so then I kind of pivoted and started seeking out more natural alternatives and, changing my diet and my lifestyle. And, because the common theme was from a lot of gastroenterologists was it doesn't matter what you eat. And just even as a, 20-year-old, 18 and 19 at the time initially, it just didn't resonate with me. My undergrad's in exercise science, exercise physiology. And I was just like, well, how does something you put in your body not either positively or negatively, impact your overall health? And so, there were just certain things like that just kind of really turned me off. And it was a slow journey for me because I was really sick. I had something called pancolitis, which is inflammation from the rectum all the way up to the small bowel. And so, got really sick in the hospital, lost 38 pounds in roughly 10 to 12 days, got C. diff on top of that while I was in the hospital. And so, fast forward a few years, I started doing a lot better just by seeing other practitioners. And it wasn't until I found a naturopathic doctor on the East Coast. I'm originally from Pittsburgh. And it was finally somebody that could orchestrate it. At the time I'd seen like a chiropractor, and then I'd see an herbalist for some herbal stuff and a nutritionist for the food. But it wasn't until I found a naturopathic doctor outside of Pittsburgh that could kind of orchestrate and kind of speak all of those modalities, right? And kind of put it all together for me in a more effective format. And then on top of that, kind of like through this whole journey, my father had been diagnosed with cancer, and we did the conventional route for the first 6 months, and it not only didn't work, but it accelerated the growth of the tumor. And so that just left us feeling very defeated. And then we ended up going to Mexico for alternative cancer care. And that just opened up my world to, all this other, all these other possibilities that they weren't at that time doing here in the US. And then probably lastly, like that was a big kind of turning point for me. But then also, I did a cardiac rehab internship with my exercise science degree. And it was, I got to do, grand rounds with cardiologists and walk the hospital with med students and see open heart surgeries and aortic dissection surgeries and all this stuff. But it was just very reactive, right? Like there was just not much focus on prevention, right? It's like, well, how do we prevent these people from ending up in this situation?
Right.
So those would probably be the three big ones of why, it kind of led me down the path of, naturopathic medicines. Because for like most people, until you have kind of a personal experience, it's like, well, they'd never heard of it.
Right. Why do you think it is that for so many med students or in med schools, there's such little education on nutrition and the role of nutrition in health?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the reason they don't know much is because there's such lack of nutrition, right? I think it's just been kind of, without going down a rabbit hole, I think it's just dominated by the pharmaceutical industry in large part, right? So there's just historically, there hasn't been a lot. I mean, there's probably a little more nutrition oriented classes now than, 20 years ago, let alone 40 years ago. But, I think that it's just, they've kind of, it's just that paradigm of medicine, right? It's just more drugs and surgery that it's the primary focus, with maybe some exceptions.
Right. So, as a naturopathic physician, how do you work to get to the root cause of patients' complaints and not just work to treat symptoms?
Yeah. And I think first it starts just with a really thorough, intake and history. And in our world, in the naturopathic medicine world and just in our practice model here, our new patients are scheduled for 90 minutes. And so it just allows us a lot of opportunity to really listen, right? To truly listen. And I think patients are just so used to giving you the Cliff Notes version of what's going on with them because they know they have a limited time, meaning like in the conventional world. One thing that we hear a lot of is like, I've never told anyone this, but ... right? And I think it's because they finally have they feel like they have the time and the freedom, right, to really explain what's going on with them and not, have to talk in sound bites for like a 5 to 15 minute, appointment. So I think for me, it starts there, right? Like that's the foundation of just really truly listening and hearing one story. And then we do, pertinent physical exams, but then really diving into what we call functional medicine testing that has become, more well-known, I think, nowadays. But it's just really utilizing certain testing that's just not widespread in the conventional world, right? That is going to provide answers different from what traditional testing, right? So it's like, yes, we still send people for imaging and we still send people for blood work daily and those sorts of things, but they have their limitations, right? And so with, we're able to do really comprehensive, DNA-based stool analysis and, breath testing and salivary hormone testing and, just utilizing various tools like that to really find answers for folks that they've been searching for, but have been told everything's normal just based on, more of the traditional, imaging, blood work type of testing.
Got it. So more time, more ability to be able to communicate, get a deeper history,
Yeah.
stronger, wider battery of tests. Yeah, I think that sounds pretty out of the norm of our 8-minute physician visits for sure. Let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit about IBS. So that's a term that's often checked in past medical history. A lot of people have. Is this a true clinical pathology? Is it a junk term that sometimes gets passed to people when their physician can't figure out what's going on? Talk to us about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's essentially a diagnosis of exclusion. It's not a true pathology. I mean, it's an official diagnosis, right, in that world, right? Like it has, that label and an ICD-10 code that's associated with it, and there's criteria for diagnosing it. But really, what it is, or what it really should be, if a patient's worked up well, is they've been worked up conventionally to roll out, things like inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, celiac disease, cancer, just more organic pathologies, right? That you could oftentimes determine and diagnose based on, endoscopies, colonoscopies, MRIs, CTs, blood work. But I see a lot of folks daily that never have had that workup, and they just get thrown that label by their primary care or their gastro without really that provider doing their due diligence to really try to figure out, are we dealing with more of an organic pathology or a functional disorder? And I'm sure we'll get to some examples of that next here, but I think it's not a helpful diagnosis, right? But, yes, it is a diagnosis, but it should be, when used properly, a diagnosis of exclusion. So at least means like, I don't have X, Y, and Z. They don't know really what's wrong with me, but I have this collection of irritable bowel symptoms.
Got it. So if somebody gets that diagnosis, are there typical triggers or reasons why people will develop that, or is it quite varied? So I think of something like back pain. So back pain can have any number of different causes for it, and yet people diagnosed with back pain. So would you say, is IBS similar? Like a lot of things can go into causing IBS. It's not just one thing, or is it pretty consistent that you've experienced in your practice or seen in your practice that will lead to IBS?
Yeah, it's multifactorial, but there are certain conditions that would be like a leading cause, right? Such as SIBO. Like there's a condition called SIBO that stands for small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And that is essentially having this overgrowth of bacteria in and throughout the 20-ish feet of the small bowel or small intestine that really shouldn't be there, right? That's kind of taken up residence and is overgrowing and multiplying. And we now know that that's the leading cause of IBS, meaning if you took, 68, like the data is anywhere from 60 to 80%, right, of folks that have IBS would test positive for SIBO. Another way of saying that is it's just the leading cause of IBS, right? But again, even though that's well established data, the average gastro, if they're suspecting IBS, will typically not test for SIBO, right? So there's still a big disconnect in the conventional world. But yes, there's other, people can have IBS-like symptoms from a number of food sensitivities, right? And it's not necessarily because they have this underlying overgrowth called SIBO. Stress plays a role, anxiety plays a role, our mental emotional state. And so yes, it is multifactorial, but in my practice, right, specializing in all things GI, by far the leading cause, right? It's just like, if somebody has that kind of general IBS like picture, it's like, you got to test, in my experience and opinion, you got to test for SIBO.
What are the most common ways that SIBO can develop in somebody?
Yeah. So the most common cause that we know of is food poisoning. And so that, and that's something where it can happen more quickly. And that could include like traveler's diarrhea, the stomach flu, that sort of clinical picture. And, but it's associated with over 40 pathologies too, right? But I would say outside of, say, like a isolated food poisoning type event, or the stomach flu, a lot of times it happens from like kind of insidiously and kind of over a period of time. You think about just past antibiotic use, that could start to disrupt that microbiome and again, this could take years or decades, right? This isn't just like, I went on an antibiotic for a sinus infection and then 3 weeks later, now I have SIBO. And so you think about from birth until now, for many of us, all the different, many of us, myself included, grew up on a number of antibiotics, right, for different things. And so just kind of starting at an early age, disrupting that microbiome. And then you think about standard American diet, right? Heavy carbohydrates, heavy sugars, processed foods, dairy, all of these things can then just contribute to that, what we call dysbiosis, right? Or imbalance within the microbiome. But there's other medications, like we know that antacids, like proton pump inhibitors, H2 agonists, those are another big cause, outside of antibiotics and think about how widespread use PPIs are, right? Like Prilosec, Prevacid. I mean, my goodness, they were never really designed to be utilized in patients for greater than 6 to 8 weeks at a time.
Right.
And I've literally on a routine basis will see people in here 30 plus years without really any breaks, right? And so they've completely disrupted the physiology within their stomach, turning off the pumps that make acid to help us better digest. And so that's a big, that's a big kind of risk factor or contributing factor as well. So yeah, again, multifactorial, but sometimes it could just be, somebody's doing everything right, but then they just got a really nasty bout of food poisoning. And then maybe within 3 to 6 months, they develop this kind of SIBO clinical picture. Some of the classic symptoms would be gas and bloating, heaviness, constipation and or diarrhea, fatigue. You can also start to develop more systemic symptoms like that. And again, if those symptoms I just rattled off, right, those are those are IBS-like symptoms, right? Like if you look up symptoms of IBS, right. So again, those symptoms can be due to a variety of things, but in our world, that's what we're really trying to figure out, right? With testing and a good history of what is this underlying cause that's leading to these symptoms, because something has to be causing it, Right. It's not just like, oh, hey, you just need to relax. And, like patients will come in and they're like, my doctor just said that like, I'm just stressed out. And that's why I have these symptoms. It's like, well, that's a contributing factor, but that's not the sole for most folks. That's not the sole underlying etiology or cause of it all.
Right. So if somebody traveled and they got a bout of traveler's diarrhea, they come back, things settle down. Do you recommend that they get some kind of workup or check just to make sure that the seed, so to speak, hasn't been planted for developing SIBO in the upcoming weeks to months?
I mean, if they came back and they had, essentially complete resolution of their symptoms, I would probably say no.
Got it.
But if it's kind of like a lot of people will say to me, man, I took this one trip and I got sick. And then I've just never really quite felt right since, right? Like they can kind of go back to that time period, right? And sometimes it's years ago, sometimes it's 3 months ago. I could be talking to somebody that's 45 and they're just like, man, when I was 32, this and this and this happened. And then ever since then, my gut's never been right, and then those alarm bells for me are just going off, right? Of like, well, tell me more about that time period and what was going on. But no, I think if somebody just went and traveled, on vacation for a week or two and got really sick or just had, straight up food poisoning or some kind of stomach bug, and then, within a reasonable amount of time, those symptoms all resolved and they don't feel like anything's lingering, I wouldn't necessarily say, they need to get worked up.
Got it. You talked a little bit about people who've been on antacids for a long time, proton pump inhibitors, those sorts of things. If somebody comes to see you and has a goal of being able to get off that medication, what does that process look like? I'm guessing it's probably a weaning process, or there are some steps rather than just cut it out. How would you work with somebody in that scenario?
Yes. And that's a very common, scenario. And I always emphasize folks, that it is likely, like I'm going to likely, even as the natural medicine guy, recommend that they taper and wean very, like more slowly than they would want to, right? Because again, when you completely disrupt that physiology in the gut, you almost have to wake up those proton pumps again, right? And so like a lot of people make the mistake of just cold turkey stopping it because they get sick of it, or they're just like, I don't know if this is working anymore, or it's working, but I'm having other symptoms. And you could just have pretty violent rebound symptoms, right? Or withdrawal symptoms. And so, yeah, for my approach anyway, would be to, try to address any underlying causes, start treatment for that. And then once it's clear that they're, improving in a noteworthy fashion with my therapy, then we would start that process of, hey, let's start tapering back on your Prilosec, and it can look like this. And some people taper really well and quickly and successfully. And then other people, it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, as far as like tapering off that med, just because of how long they've been on it.
So it sounds like it could sometimes be a shorter process, but sometimes can be a longer process of
Yes.
weaning off of that as well.
Yep.
Got it. Talk a little bit about leaky gut. A lot of people have heard that term, maybe don't know what it means, what the consequence is of it, how it develops. Tell us a little bit about that and how it develops and what it can lead to.
Yeah. So when people say leaky gut, it's really referring to what we call intestinal permeability, where that gut lining, that barrier in the gut is just more porous, right? And it becomes essentially leaky, right? Things are, um, did I lose you? Oh,
Yeah, I'm back. I'm gonna, whoops. So a lot of people have heard about leaky gut. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that is, what it means, how does it happen, and what are the consequences?
sure. So leaky gut is referring to something called intestinal permeability, where that gut lining becomes more porous, right, or leaky, if you will, to where larger particles and substances are crossing through the gut lining, essentially into the bloodstream.
Hmm.
And that's why people just kind of, as a layman term, say leaky gut, because things are essentially leaking through there that otherwise weren't really designed to leak through there, and that can cause a whole host of symptoms over time. And it could be anything from bacteria to larger food particles. And when that starts to happen, people, yes, can have digestive symptoms, but can also develop a lot of systemic symptoms too, right? Headaches, fatigue, skin issues, and anything that essentially disrupts the micro or the gut lining itself, that intestinal mucosal lining, can cause intestinal permeability, right? So we've been talking a little bit about SIBO. That is a big contributor to leaky gut. Crohn's and colitis, right? So inflammatory bowel disease can cause leaky gut. Many medications can cause leaky gut. Processed foods, sugar. We know sugar, just straight up sugar, can cause that lining to be disrupted. Stress, chronic stress. So I mean, there, you could just see. I'm just trying to, give you an idea of just how widespread and what can contribute to that. And so in my world, right, if I'm suspicious of that, and from the data, right, anytime somebody has noteworthy overgrowth, they have SIBO or some other kind of dysbiosis, and again, dysbiosis is just be an imbalance within the microbiome. That is a form of leaky gut, right? Like that we know, like, yes, there's ways you can test for leaky gut, right? There's a variety of testing in the functional medicine world. There's something called a lactulose mannitol test. You could test zonulin via the stool. The lactulose mannitol is urine. You could do different types of specialized blood work to figure it out. But, in reality, it's like if there's some noteworthy imbalances in the gut, you could fairly accurately assume there's some intestinal permeability as well, just from the nature of that.
Sure. How is it that stress, what's the physiological process that the physical sort of manifestation of stress can lead to leaky gut?
Yeah, I think it has to do with if you think about stress, if we're in a chronically stressed out state, that sympathetic nervous system, kind of like the gas pedal, right, of the nervous system, if you will, is in overdrive, or it's overactive, or kind of like that analogy of like gas pedal to the floor type of deal. And the parasympathetic controls our bowels, right, our bodily fluids. And if that's chronically being overridden by the sympathetic, meaning you don't have a nice checks and balance between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, that could start to disrupt, different physiological functions within the gastrointestinal tract, right?
Mm.
And then, can develop into, things like leaky gut or other types of conditions. And that's why stress is so important. I mean, I think, in the conventional world, it gets thrown, like patients will share often that like, oh, they said I'm just stressed out, or they think it's all in my head, or they just said, why don't you try an anxiety medication, when they're coming in with maybe like IBS-like symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it gets overutilized a lot. But yes, it is a big contributing factor for these things. And you could see those physiological changes. But again, it's like, usually there's other things, for me, it's like, okay, well, why are you so stressed? Right? Are you in a toxic job? Are you in a toxic relationship? Is there past trauma? Like, what is it that you're stuck in this, kind of hyper aroused sympathetic overdrive state?
Are there certain things that people can take to help repair that gut lining? So I would think clearly if there are offending foods that somebody's having, you talked about sugar, highly processed foods, things that could damage the gut lining. So the first step would be get those out and don't
Yes.
continue to consume those things. But what about the repairing? Is that something that the body will just do automatically once those offending things aren't in there? Or do you have to take certain steps with either supplementation or different things to help that repair process happen for the gut?
Sure. So yeah, like you mentioned already, step one would be what we call remove the obstacles to cure, right? And so that would be avoid the offending agent, or if they're on certain medications, hopefully over time being able to get them off of medications if we think that that's contributing to it. But yes, there are direct nutrients that can actually go in there and start to heal up that gut lining. Or to go back to maybe a SIBO example is, the first step would be to get rid of the bacteria or archaea that's overgrown in and throughout the small bowel. And a lot of times by doing that, like if you remove that intestinal overgrowth, then, in theory, but in a lot of times in reality, that gut lining will start to heal up again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because under the right circumstances, the body has the innate ability to heal. And a lot of times we're just using our therapies as a catalyst to help, push it in the right direction, if you will, or nudge it along. But there's other times, like if you're dealing with like more severe pathology, organic pathology, like Crohn's and colitis. Yes. I mean, I'm using a lot of different types of herbs and nutrients to actually help directly repair and heal up that mucosal lining.
How long does that take? Or again, is it all across the board depending on the length of time that there's been this intestinal permeability? Is it days to years? Is it that much of a spread as far as what it can take to heal that?
I mean, I would say months to years, depending, right? So if it's something like SIBO, I wouldn't put it in the years category. But if it's something like, noteworthy Crohn's and colitis, right, where there's a lot of inflammation and there has been a lot of inflammation for years, if not decades, it can take years to really fully heal up that mucosal lining. But if you're talking something like SIBO that really disrupted that lining and is causing some intestinal permeability, it could be, 3 to 6 months or 6 to 12 months, depending on, other factors. Right. But yeah, so it does vary. And even just like the treatment for SIBO, I've even treated folks, maybe I'm treating a mom and 2 kids or a mom and a dad and a kid. And so they're all within the same nuclear family and they'll respond to like drastically to different timelines, right? Like it might take the 2 kids a few months and they're back, to where we want them. And then mom takes 6 months, dad takes 9 months. Right. And so we'll even see that. And I think a lot of that just has to do with susceptibility. Right. And I mean, and I'm saying, giving these examples, assuming that they're all relatively compliant. Right.
Right.
It's just part of that susceptibility picture that we'll see. And so, yes, it does vary widely.
With regards to development of autoimmune conditions, how commonly do you think gut dysfunction is as a primary catalyst for that?
Well, I mean, when you think about it, 70 to 80% of our immune cells reside in the gut,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so if you have a lot of gut dysfunction, it's going to affect the immune system, right? And having proper gut function is imperative for that immune system to work optimally and reduce the risk of inflammation and then subsequent autoimmune dysfunction. So yeah, I think that, and as cliche as it may sound to some folks, it really does start at the gut level. Like so much of these issues start at the gut level and go outward, right? Just like when people come in and, assuming they're not in that, pubescent stage of life, and they have really bad, like if I have an adult with really bad cystic acne or acne rosacea or other skin issues, psoriasis, eczema, that's all oftentimes coming from the gut, right? And that's the first place we want to look. Even if somebody, like I've had people come in and they have acne rosacea and restless leg syndrome, really no digestive symptoms to speak of. And I say to them, I start to share like, hey, I want to do these tests. Like I want to do a stool test. I want to do a breath test for SIBO. And they're like, well, what do you mean? Like, I don't really have digestive symptoms. And then I go and explain why, and the rationale for that. And then it makes sense to them, but they're not coming in thinking that they have anything wrong with their gut, right? They've never even associated that there might be some gut dysfunction there, and a lot of people also would have gut symptoms, right? But I've had people that come in just with these other things. You treat the SIBO, like let's just say they have SIBO, restless leg syndrome goes away and their skin and their face looks so much better. And that redness from the rosacea resolves. I mean, it's wild. Like it's incredible.
Yeah. It's kind of a running joke in our house. So my wife Leah is a nutritionist, and when it comes to just about anything, it always comes back to something going on in the gut, whether it's a skin thing or it's like a
Yep.
behavioral thing with our kids or something. And she's usually right. I mean, she addresses it. She does a lot of hard work to get them to clean things up, and supplementation is needed. But it's kind of a funny thing. It's like, ah, broke my toe. Got to be the
Yeah.
gut. It's just obviously we don't go to that extreme. But talk a little bit about the relationship of gut health to cognitive health. So particularly as we age, a lot of people have concerns about cognitive decline, dementia,
Mhm.
Alzheimer's, things of that sort. How does the gut relate to our cognitive well-being?
Yeah, like you'll hear a lot of folks, you'll say like the brain gut connection, or the gut brain axis, and a lot of that has to do with the vagus nerve, which is the largest cranial nerve, and that's kind of this pathway or this communication between the central nervous system and the gut, right? And if that's impaired on some level, like we know, hopefully not to over talk about SIBO, but we know that SIBO oftentimes will damage on some level the vagus nerve, right? Or there's some
Mm.
impairment with the vagus nerve with SIBO. But again, head trauma, surgery, medications, like there's all kinds of things that can affect the vagus nerve to where it's not working optimally, right? And this neural pathway is vital for regulating emotion, stress, responses, digestion. And so if there's not good communication, just like in life, right? Like if there's not good communication, we're not going to see things working optimally. And then on top of that, right, you could even have folks with dysbiosis, like a yeast overgrowth, fungal overgrowth, or bacteria, like we've been talking about, and they'll have tremendous what we call like brain fog, right, or what they refer to as brain fog, where it's just like this cloudy thinking. Other people will say like, "Man, I don't even drink alcohol, but I feel hungover most days, right?
Mm.
Like I just feel like my head's in the clouds," and that could cause profound cognitive things. Just again going back to imbalances in the gut. But yeah, the vagus nerve plays a huge role in that as well.
I work with a number of people that will have head trauma, concussions after the fact, and to my knowledge, there certainly is a lot more understanding about concussions and post-concussion rehab and therapy. Certainly, in light of all the happenings with the NFL and even soccer players and that sort of thing, there's certainly a lot more light shed on that. But to my knowledge, there's not really any consistent mechanism where the neurologist or whoever the, sort of head of the team will talk to people about getting a workup of their gut. Do you think that would be an important component of rehabilitation following a concussion or head injury?
Yeah, I do. I think that anything we could do, because sometimes, like you said, we're more limited, or it's just like providing time for that patient to heal, right? That person to heal. And so, yeah, I mean, I think anytime we could dig deeper, go a step further within reason makes a lot of sense. But you're right. It oftentimes falls short because, again, they're looking oftentimes through a certain lens, and that's different than what we're talking about here within the functional medicine, naturopathic medicine world. But yeah, I think that could absolutely make a lot of sense.
So when you think of some of your favorite foods for brain health, what are some of the things that you recommend to somebody who maybe comes in and their primary complaint is cognitive decline or early onset Alzheimer's or something like that, and they say, I'm willing to do anything. What are some of the foods that I need to get in my diet today? Do you have any recommendations for them?
Yeah, I think yes, some recommendation, but also some things to avoid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a lot more data that has come out over the years. And David Perlmutter, he's a functional neurologist, MD, but functional neurologist in Florida. And he's written several books, but he's brought a lot of research to light on how grains in general, right? Particularly gluten and gluten containing grains, but really just grains as a whole, really are a big contributing factor for a lot of these neurological and progressive disorders that we're now seeing, decades earlier in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of folks, right? Particularly in America because of our diet system and food system. And he's a big advocate for essentially avoiding all grains or greatly minimizing grains, and that actually can have a profound impact on cognitive health. I mean, even when people do, say they do like Whole30, right? Or they're like, hey, I'm going to go, more paleo for a couple of months. Those folks will oftentimes report that they have less brain fog, they can think more clearly, they have less fatigue, better concentration and focus. So again, remove obstacles, right? So that would be one. But then, we know that blueberries, right? Like as far as like one would be one food that is really helpful, really high in antioxidants, helpful for, brain health. And those would be some of the things to think about from that standpoint.
Do you have any sense of creatine as something that can affect both the gut and the brain? Traditionally that was taken by athletes to promote, strength and that sort of thing, but there's been a lot of people, I guess, in the biohacker world that have done more research about the effects of the brain. And I don't know, are there effects in the gut as well from creatine?
For sure, from a cognitive standpoint, there, and even just in the last couple of years, that's really been brought more to light, right, with some data. And even in that like 10 to 20 gram dosage for creatine, whereas like historically or growing up, like I remember taking creatine in high school, right, when you're lifting weights, and I think around the time, a standard dose was like 5 grams.
Right.
And now, right, from a cognitive piece, where it's more widespread recommended, like, what it's really looking like is almost anybody could benefit, right, from
Mm-hmm.
it. And when you're really trying to do, like, yes, it helps with, strength and power, and recovery and things like that. But they're also finding, especially in that like 10 to 20 gram dosage based on the person, really helping from a cognitive standpoint and an overall, brain health support standpoint.
Sure.
Um,
I'm curious to go back to what you talked about with Dr. Perlmutter and his advice to avoid grains. Does he make any distinction between the grains that we have here in the United States compared to European grains? I mean, I think of a lot of traditional diets over in Europe, whether it's Italian cuisine or French cuisine, where they eat a lot of bread or they eat a lot of pasta, and it doesn't seem like they probably have the same levels of onset of early dementia, Alzheimer's, as we do in the United States. So, is there a distinction that could be made or should be made between the types of grains here versus more, I guess we could call traditional grains?
yes, absolutely. So here, we, in America and our food supply, a lot of the, wheat has been just so cross hybridized, right? So not technically genetically modified like they do for soy and corn and crops like that, but uh, just sticking with wheat here for a moment, it's been cross hybridized, which has manipulated, that the amount of gluten peptides or proteins per stalk of wheat, right?
Hmm.
Like even like the wheat that our grandparents and great grandparents have eaten, right? And compared to what we've grown up eating is drastically different. And so yes, there is a distinction there. And in other parts of the world, like you mentioned, like I'll even have patients, some of them go to Europe once or twice a year. Um, and they know that they could have like a croissant at the cafe in Paris, right? Or they can have pizza in Italy, or a baguette wherever, right? And again, it's because they don't allow, like a lot of Europe and other parts of the world don't allow these um, various foods into their country, right? And so yeah, there is a big difference between the two, and they'll say like, oh man, and sometimes it'll mess with their head to the point where it's just like, oh man, I had that pizza here, and then they come back and try to have like pizza locally in America, and all their symptoms return, right? They just feel awful. So yes, there, a lot of that has to do with that. So and again, a good percentage of the world though is eating that cross hybridized grain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just in America, but yes, certain parts of the world, and kudos to them, right? That they don't allow it into their food supply.
We'll have to send this video to the Parisian tourist board and they can start marketing to people who want to do some travel to get that croissant or that pizza
Yes.
again. Um, let's talk a little bit about antibiotics. You mentioned them earlier as a potential catalyst, at least for some people, for developing things like SIBO. If somebody's been on antibiotics, let's say acutely, they just finish up with a 10-day, 7-day, 21-day course of antibiotics, how long does it take to replenish the gut microbiome? And what are some of the recommendations you have for that individual with regards to replenishing the gut microbiome?
Sure. So, I mean, there's studies out there, and I haven't looked at any lately, but years ago, there was some studies showing that a single course, right? So picture like a 7 or 10 day or 14 day, course of antibiotics, somewhere in that window. So they took antibiotics and stopped them. It could disrupt the microbiome for up to 2 years
Mm.
after that single course of antibiotics, right? And some, it's not uncommon for people to even like they're having more than one antibiotic in a given year, right? Um, and so, um, yes, the it can be very disruptive to that microbiome. And how I would approach that is, giving them, pretty high dose probiotics, broad spectrum, but also spore forming probiotics, both during their course. But if that wasn't possible, or they came in between, at their next visit and said like, oh, 2 weeks ago I was on an antibiotic for, a sinus infection, then for at least a good month or two, I do some pretty high dose supplementation with a variety of different types of probiotic strains, and then go down to more of a maintenance dose. Because I'm a big advocate of, from a foundational standpoint, I really do believe everybody should be on some form of a high quality probiotic, right? Just to help continue to keep balance within the microbiome, just because of all the things that we're exposed to and consuming and breathing and all these things. But then again, of course, if you're on antibiotics, you would definitely require or warrant a higher, dosage for a period of time.
Right. How about things like prebiotics and fiber? How does that fit into the gut building process?
Yeah, so prebiotics, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, in the sense of like, yes, we do need probiotics, and they serve as a food source or a fuel source for the beneficial bacteria in the gut. But a lot of times, like if somebody, like if with my demographic of patients, they oftentimes have to be very careful with prebiotics, because prebiotics can also feed undesirable bacteria
Mm.
as well,
Hmm.
right? So if you did have somebody with small intestine bacterial overgrowth, um, and they're taking a probiotic, and this isn't uncommon, right? Like they're just happen to take a probiotic on their own, or maybe from another provider, that without knowing maybe a better understanding what's going on with that person's gut. A lot of probiotics have like probiotic formulas have prebiotics in them, right? Like
Mm.
these long chain, essentially carbohydrates, fructooligosaccharides, or FOS, or inulin, or chicory root would be some common examples. And they're not inherently bad, right? Like it makes sense why they would be in certain formulas, but for that specific person, they wouldn't want to take a probiotic typically with a lot of prebiotics while we're trying to get rid of overgrowth, because it could kind of be like sprinkling gas on the fire a little bit. And you're just
Got it.
feeding what you're trying to balance out.
Got it. Are there recommendations you have for people about a certain number of grams of fiber in a day?
Yeah, I think for most of us, we're nowhere near where we should be. And I would say in the ballpark of 30 to 50, 30 to 50 grams of fiber. And that could be from a variety of sources. And, sometimes people do need to be careful with the type of fiber they're having until their gut's more healed out. But that doesn't mean like you don't continue to eat vegetables, right? I'm talking about people that are like thinking they're maybe doing a good thing because, they read something or heard something. And it's like every morning in my smoothie, I put ground flax seeds and chia seeds and hemp seeds. And it's not like none of those, right, are bad, right? Like they're nutrient dense foods. But when you have something like SIBO, that could just be exacerbating their bloating and their level of gassiness and heaviness, just because it could be feeding some of that undesirable bacteria.
Sure. Yeah.
So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think at the end of the day, probably more vegetables, things that are going to be more like what our ancestors would have eaten. But if a person is feeling, like you mentioned, bloating or heaviness after a meal that's with good and healthy food, a lot of
Mhm.
veggies, lots of fiber, that maybe it would be worth getting a look at what could be going on in their gut to lead to that. Is that fair to say?
Yes, because if you're, like a lot of people come in and they say, look, the healthier I eat, the worse I feel, right?
Mm,
And a lot of times that's because if they're eating a lot of vegetables and salads and other things that they maybe perceive as very healthy and nutrient dense, which they may be, those if there's some noteworthy imbalances in the gut, you'll feel like that, right?
mm,
Um, where it's like, oh, I switched to just eating whole grains and, I'm not eating a bunch of, what they perceive as, say, crappy carbohydrates. It could still be very problematic. And that's where you want to look at that, short of, like, yes, there's certain vegetables, right? Like the cruciferous family, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower, like they have higher, sulfur containing compounds to where, compared to other veggies, they're going to make most people gassy, right?
mm,
And then it's
mhm.
just the level of like how much in a serving can that person tolerate. But yes, if somebody's eating a lot of things like that, like even just vegetables, salads, and they just feel like, man, I just, like some people will say to me, like, I eat a salad and I feel like somebody's sitting on my stomach.
Mhm.
There's got to be something going on there because those foods shouldn't do that
Right.
if things are functioning normally, right? And we're not just talking about if somebody's like, hey, I haven't eaten beans in years and then I went crazy for a month trying to increase my bean intake. Well, of course that person's going to feel gassy and bloated most likely, right? And that may
Mhm.
not even be from an overgrowth. It just be their gut adjusting, to that level of fiber and food. But yes, the short answer would be yes, because there's oftentimes something going on that's preventing a reaction to those foods.
Sure. So you've talked about a couple strategies that you recommend for people. For example, most people probably could benefit from supplementing with probiotics, for example. What about some things that you would consider non-negotiables in your daily or weekly routine just to maximize your gut health? And that could be anything from feeding window to, you already
Yep.
mentioned grams of fiber in a day. What are some of the that you would consider your non-negotiables for your own gut health?
Yeah, I think that eating as clean as possible, right? So, um, a whole foods type based diet and trying to stay away from processed foods as much as possible. And and taking a step further, depending on folks' resources and just trying to be a savvy shopper, right? Of like buying organic for certain things that make more sense to buy organic and conventional veggies and fruits when it makes sense. Meaning like if folks are familiar with like the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15,
Mm,
right? Food list that the Environmental Working Group puts out year to year on, kind of the highest pesticide and contaminated produce versus the least contaminated. And, versus like just trying to buy everything organic, which could be, cost prohibitive for a lot of folks. And so, looking at things like that, drinking a lot of water, right? Like people, I mean, it's amazing. I ask every single new patient how many ounces of water do they average per day, and they're not. I mean, they're oftentimes like 1/4 or 1/5 where they should be,
mm,
right? And like my role would be like half of one's body weight in ounces. That increases, if you're working out in, the temperatures we've been having here in the mid 80s, obviously increase that. But like just as a foundational standpoint, right? Like you have people come in and they're chronically constipated, and one of the first questions I ask is like, well, how's your fluid intake? And it's just like, I probably get like 15 ounces a day in plus coffee and tea. It's just like, man, we got to start with the with the fundamentals here. And then, avoiding if we're talking personally, right? Like I try to avoid a lot of sugar, gluten, and other grains, alcohol. We know all three of those things, right? And processed foods could be another group. Can really disrupt that microbiome, like we're talking about. And it's surprising how much certain foods, like if people really start paying attention and try to be a good historian or keep a diet diary, or when they remove those foods and they add them back in, it maybe is more noticeable of how foods impact our mental emotional state day to day, right? Like
mhm.
it's not uncommon where people will discover when they do have something containing gluten or wheat, they actually feel more anxious, their heart races more, they feel a little jittery, right? Almost like caffeine for some folks, right? And then, caffeine doesn't affect other people the same way, and neither does gluten and wheat. And so again, we always want to individualize these things, right? And be careful about making broad generalizations. But gluten in particular, like if people ask me like, what's one food or food group I should just avoid, even without knowing much about them, and this is just based on data and experience, I would say, like if we're not talking sugar, because sugar would be like maybe number one as a whole, but would be gluten, right? Because we know it is so inflammatory. And even people that don't have celiac or even like non-celiac gluten sensitivity diagnosis, there's such a high percentage of people where it's still causing low-grade inflammation in their gut or other systemic symptoms like fatigue, headaches, even if, all the testing is negative for them. So those would be some. Mentioned probiotics. And then as far as a feeding window, I try to get people to steer away from grazing throughout the day. Mm-hmm. And a lot of my patients, because of what I focus in, will come in grazing and eating, maybe 5, 6, 7 smaller meals a day, just because that's how they manage their symptoms. Right. And it's just like, well, I can't eat a normal size meal or even a big meal. And so they're constantly grazing. But once I explain to them that that's impairing this thing called the migrating motor complex, or MMC for short, it's kind of like the housekeeper or the house cleaner of the gut. It's what's responsible for peristalsis and kind of moving contents through the gut. But it's most active during states of fasting. Anytime we go 90 minutes or more without eating, it kicks in and does its thing. Well, if you have somebody eating every 2 or 3 hours, it's never really given the opportunity to fully clean out the gut, right? And do what it's supposed to do. And so, just like I try to get people away from eating at bedtime for that reason too. So you're not directly impairing the migrating motor complex versus capitalizing on, most of us are going, unless we're doing time restricted eating or intermittent fasting, we're usually going the longest time overnight while we're sleeping fasting. Right. Than other parts of the day. So that would be one to consider for folks, especially even though it might sound contrary to what they might think. It's like, I want to get those folks that have a lot of gut issues eating, at regular intervals, not just like grazing all day long.
Yeah. This is awesome. I think this is a wealth of information for people to be able to start to adopt today. No cost solutions, maybe choosing differently about some of the foods that you're putting into the body. If people maybe have some of the symptoms that you've described, gas, bloating, brain fog, feel worse after you've been eating meals, and they're interested in working with you, Dr. Nate, how can they find you?
Yeah, the best resource would probably be to go to our website, which is championnh.com. So ChampionNH.com. I always like to let folks know there's 2 N's in a row there, championnh.com. And on there, you'll find a lot of information about our practice and kind of more about who we are. But there's also some nice resources, like we have a free SIBO guide download. It's like just a couple page brochure that kind of talks about in greater detail, all things SIBO, and kind of if you're having, any number of these symptoms based on these questions, you might be someone that's suffering from SIBO. But yeah, the website would be the best way to get a hold of us. And our email's on there. Of course, our phone number's on there, and a bunch of other resources.
Awesome. Do you see people over telehealth as well? Let's say they're in a different state.
Yep. Yeah. We do telehealth as well as in person. And really do have patients from all across the country.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for taking the time today. This was great. I learned a lot about my gut and, making sure that I'm doing some of the things that I need to do to keep it dialed in. And as you said, and many people have talked about, it's really the second brain, if not the biggest brain in the body, and making sure that we're feeding it to nourish both our mind and our body and keep our inflammation down. I think it's really, really helpful. So thanks so much for being here. I appreciate it and hope to talk to you soon.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for listening to the Better with Age podcast with my guest today, Dr. Nate Champion. If you're interested in working with Dr. Nate, you can check out his company, which is Champion Naturopathic Health. Their website is www.championnh.com. And you can email them at info@championnh.com, and also find them on Facebook if you are interested. If you're interested in learning more about healthy aging from a physical perspective, gaining muscle, bone density, gut health, brain health, consider checking out the Better with Age program. This is a program my wife, Leah, who's a licensed nutritionist, and I put together to help individuals thrive as they age. So you do not need to settle on slowing down and getting weaker. You can actually thrive into your later years. That is our mission, to help you do so. You can learn more about the Better with Age program at www.betterwithage.online. Until next time, this is Galen signing off. Have a wonderful evening or day wherever you happen to be.